Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Center for International Governance Innovation, or CIGI as we say. My name is Fred Kuntz and I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs here at CIGI. Tonight, CIGI is pleased to partner with the Canadian International Council Waterloo branch to present our annual media panel. The Waterloo CIC branch has been a faithful sponsor of this event for 8 years, and in particular I'd like to recognize and thank Chapter President Paul Doherty, who's here with us tonight along with many of the group's members. Also with us are several members of the CIGI Board of Directors who met in Waterloo today, led by our chair and founder, Jim Walmsley. Following this evening's presentation, we welcome questions from the audience, either at the microphones here at CIGI at the bottom of the stairs on the aisles, or through the live chat function of your screen if you're watching from home. Please remember to state your name and to keep the questions brief. We're here tonight to hear from leaders in Canadian news media about how we get our news from outside Canada. We all know that traditional major media are under budget pressures. In the public sector, CBC funding has been cut over multiple years, and in the private sector, print and broadcast media such as the Globe and Mail, Toronto Star, and CTV are struggling to find new economic models as the media audience finds new and alternative channels for information and entertainment online. Of course, the new technologies also offer new and creative ways to tell the stories. But one of the more expensive types of news coverage to deliver is foreign news. You must either maintain costly bureaus in other countries or fly your correspondents around on planes, put them in hotels, and often pay for translators or even local minders with jeeps and AK-47s to help keep the reporters safe. And Lord knows it can be very dangerous. In conflict zones, which can also mean expensive insurance and paying for hazardous zones training for staff. So when the money crunch comes, it may be tempting for media executives to reduce foreign coverage. And the question for all of us is, are we getting less than we used to? And how much does it really matter if we get our news from Canadian sources? Or can we get pretty much the same thing from CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, Russia Today, and Fox News? Our distinguished panelists will be introduced in just a moment by tonight's moderator, Susan Harada. Susan is herself an accomplished journalist and foreign correspondent. She's currently Associate Director of the School of Journalism and Communications, Program Head of Journalism, and an Associate Professor at Carleton University. And in her long and successful career at the CBC, she was a parliamentary correspondent for The National. She covered defense, foreign affairs, and other beats. She worked in the Washington and London bureaus, and her many award-winning stories from around the world included coverage of the cocaine trade in Peru and the US drug war, the Canadian military missions in Bosnia and Somalia, the Los Angeles riots after the Rodney King verdict, and the Rwandan genocide. She's always been a serious, committed, and excellent journalist, even when cutting her teeth at Ryerson University in the especially bumper crop journalism class of 1980. And so I now turn it over to her. The floor is yours, Susan Harada.
Thank you, Fred. Good evening, everyone. As Fred said, there was a time when Canadian news budgets started getting squeezed. They still are being squeezed, and along with that, international coverage also started being squeezed. In the midst of this, the late James Travers, the accomplished Canadian journalist who covered Africa and the Middle East in the course of his career, argued passionately for the maintenance of foreign bureaus. He said journalism must play a role if Canadians were to be full citizens of the world and have a grasp of the importance of evolving patterns out there. And he noted that it has never been more important, and the importance will continue to grow as world events accelerate and this country tries to find its place in them. Well, Travers said those words more than 10 years ago. Since then, the pace of global events has accelerated, and here we are tonight to discuss Canadian journalism's role in and responsibility for bringing the news from around the world home, to the home audience here. So let me introduce the people you'll be hearing from tonight, all of them distinguished journalists. We'll start right down at the end with Lynn McAuley, the Associate Editor of the Toronto Star. As Associate Editor, Lynn McAuley is responsible for foreign news and features, including weekend sections such as the World Weekly and Insight, as well as special projects. She's been with the Star for 10 years and has served in a variety of roles, including city editor and head of digital news. She's currently working on Star Touch, the Star's tabloid edition, which is slated to launch in the fall. And she's been working on foreign news since 2011, which is the same year that the World Weekly, the premium section for home subscribers, was launched. Her life before the Star was at the Ottawa Citizen. She was managing editor there for 5 years, oversaw the Citizen's Weekly, the Citizen Style section, and special projects. Right next to her, David Walmsley, the editor-in-chief of the Globe and Mail. And for somebody whose professional life was ignited overseas, he's a veteran of leading media organizations here in Canada. He arrived here as a launch editor of the National Post in 1998. He's worked at the Toronto Star, and he was both managing editor and national editor at the Globe. He was the director of news content at the CBC, responsible for news coverage across digital, radio, and television. He rejoined the Globe in March 2014, and that's where he still is. Before the Canadian leg of his career, he worked as a news reporter for the Belfast Telegraph, Daily Record in Glasgow, and the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph in London. Beside him, Wendy Freeman, president of CTV News. Wendy Freeman has been president since December 2010 and is responsible for news, information, and current affairs programming. She presides over all Bell Media News editorial content and news gathering efforts for television and digital, and oversees day-to-day operations. Under her leadership, the CTV News Division has won a host of RTNDA awards for local and national news programs, and she too has been singled out for praise. In 2012, she was named one of Canada's most powerful women by the Women's Executive Network. Before she became president, Wendy Freeman held a variety of senior management positions with CTV News, and life before CTV included work at TV stations in New York and Detroit, as well as at City TV in Toronto, where she began her TV career. She's a Montreal native, graduated from the University of Western Ontario with a BA in philosophy. And right beside Wendy, Jonathan Whitten, Executive Director of News Content with the CBC, and that's a position he's been in since spring of 2010. And it means he now manages the fully integrated assignment operation and the delivery of news content across all the platforms. He's a graduate of the journalism program at Carleton University. Excellent choice. In the early days, he worked as a TV news reporter in Saskatoon and Fredericton, and then moved to Ontario, where he filled a number of positions. He was assignment editor for the National in Toronto, assignment editor and field producer in the Parliamentary Bureau, then headed back to Toronto as show producer for Sunday Report and the National. He launched and produced the News World Foreign Affairs program Schlesinger, spent 2 years in Washington as bureau producer, and finally returned to Toronto as a senior producer and then executive producer of the National before taking up his current position. And if it sounds like all of them have done an awful lot in their careers, they have. It's quite a distinguished panel to talk to you tonight about Canada's coverage of the world. But before we launch into our discussion, just for the benefit of you all, I'll let you know how things will unfold. Our panelists will each have a chance to make short opening remarks to outline their respective news organizations' approach to international coverage. And that really is the only formal part of the evening. As Fred mentioned, what will follow will be, after some 30 to 40 minutes of discussion here, will be discussion that involves you, with microphones at both sides of the room, and we'll have questions from our online audience as well. And we'll aim to pass things back to Fred at about 8:45, so let's jump right in here. Starting with Jonathan, and then moving down the line, the two broad questions that you were each asked to address in opening remarks. How important is it to have Canadian eyes on world news, and what is your media outlet's basic approach?
So thanks, Susan. I just wanted to say first to remind you that David's actually done 2 tours of the CBC, not 1. So any difficult questions about the CBC, you should feel free to throw them in his direction as well. And the Star actually as well, David, right? So you can take Lynn's questions as well. Rather than going through where our bureaus are in sort of a detail-by-detail approach to this question, I think I'll take a look at two points of view on the question of, as Fred put at the beginning, how much does it matter that we have Canadians abroad? I mean, first of all, I guess a more predictable answer, and one that you would expect from someone like myself who's both been in foreign news and now manages it. And followed by, I guess, a potentially more modern answer and, just for fun, a potentially contradictory answer to the first one. So first of all, we clearly feel it's extremely important to have people in places where news is happening outside of this country. There's no question about that. And I'll tell you a little story which illustrates this, and it involves Brian Stewart, who is no longer with us, but at the time that I was the National in the mid-2000s, was key to our coverage of many of the global conflicts that were unfolding at that time, Afghanistan and Iraq. The world was in turmoil then, and he was a person who we turned to at the National to tell stories about what was happening in countries outside of Canada. And to the point where he gained a reputation as somebody who could do that from the newsroom in Toronto. And again, to the point where that caught notice with some of the higher people in our organization outside the news department who started to realize that here is a guy who is incredibly smart, has a lot of experience, context, and can deliver information to people about what's happening outside of our country, yet is based in Toronto. They brought him to lunch and said, Brian, you're really telling people what's happening, yet you're not based in a foreign country. Why is it then that we actually spend the money we're spending as an organization having people living in foreign countries when you can do that job equally as well from here? And it's an explanation that always stuck in my mind through the years, but Brian, said, I'm sure almost instantly, that the only way he was able to do that, the only way he was able to provide context and analysis on what was happening in the world was by he himself having lived outside the country and worked as a foreign correspondent in a number of places over a number of years for different organizations in his case, and by repeatedly going back to various war zones over time. I mean, I use Brian's name not because we have a number of foreign correspondents who are incredible storytellers and have done incredible work, but Brian really personified this idea of being able to tell the world's story from Canada, but he made the point very clearly that in order to do that, he needed that experience that he gathered from abroad. In his words, it's not only about getting skills and contacts, but it's understanding how to see Canada's role in the world from being outside of this country, and also understanding the complexity of foreign affairs from a perspective outside of this country. So clearly, in answer to Fred's question, it matters a great deal that we have people positioned outside of Canada telling stories to Canadians about what's happening in the world. So having said that, I think it's also important to think, maybe to stimulate some discussion and debate about a revolution that we're seeing and that many of you are aware of in the digital realm, which is changing the face of journalism in so many ways, and I think in terms of foreign affairs coverage as well. And that's to say that there's a growing group of people whose job it is, who've become experts at understanding what's happening in this world from here in Canada. So from the comfort of a newsroom in Toronto or wherever else it may be, sort of leveraging and understanding information that's pouring in second by second, minute by minute from the millions of people who are wired right now and can deliver photographs, video, text, and other information immediately around the world. So yes, there's this obvious need to be where things are happening, but personally I see an incredible opportunity in being able to tell the foreign story as well from being able to tap into the digital revolution that's happening, the people around the world who have access to instant information and being able to deliver things instantly to us. So you'll know that, there are many examples. One that sticks in my mind certainly is the capture or killing of Osama bin Laden, and the fact that that story actually broke in social media. And when I say broke in social media, that's not uncommon. Many stories first appear on Twitter or other places, but the actual operation, the helicopters hovering over the compound in Pakistan, was seen first by somebody with a camera and with the ability to get that information out. And that really is a lesson for all of us, understanding that being on the ground is important, but it's also important understanding being able to gather and grab those things as they come in. Now, obviously, in that case, the Osama bin Laden case, we didn't actually know what was happening at the time, and I guess that's what I'm saying here. We need to develop a strong group of people who can actually cut through the many things that we receive on social media, are able to package it, find the story within it, verify it, and put it together in a way that makes sense for people. So it is about following and understanding what's happening in the world of social media. It's also about taking a look at data that's available in social media or just in general on the internet. So I think I just wanted to start by obviously, punctuating the need to have people abroad, but also to let people think about certainly where we're going, which is to understand that there's a whole other world out there and a world that we need to understand and that can be extremely valuable to us. So nothing like being there, obviously. That's so important. But there are other things happening in this in the foreign reporting space.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on now to Wendy Freeman.
Hi there, good evening. I wrote a little something this morning because I wanted to share some of our network's history with you and where we are now as far as foreign news. 10 years ago at CTV News, there were 9 foreign bureaus, and most of these bureaus consisted of a camera person, a sound person, a producer, and a correspondent, 4 people. In fact, sometimes the Bureau even had a 5th person that did the administration of the so-called traditional bureau. Today, we only have 5 foreign bureaus at CTV. We have Beijing, Jerusalem, London, and Washington, and Los Angeles. Bureaus that are no longer are Moscow, Sydney, Kampala, and Mexico City. In each bureau currently, we have a shooter and a correspondent. We do have 1 producer in Washington. As you can see, the old traditional fixed bureau of the past is definitely becoming extinct. However, the closing of these 5 bureaus over the years has not just been for economical reasons. In today's world, it has become easier to have what we call short-term bureaus, where we send correspondents into a story for a shorter amount of time. Some examples, we were recently in Nepal, where we reported for a few weeks on the quake disaster, and we will go back soon again to update the story. We did the same for the Haiti earthquake, the tsunamis in Japan and Southeast Asia. And when our Canadian troops were based in Kandahar and Kabul, we were also there for a few years. When the Sochi Games were held last year, we spent a few months in Russia. We also had a bureau in Baghdad for a few years, and I can go on and on. Technology now makes it easier to file our stories, and it is easier to get places, much easier and faster than in the past, as we are no longer lugging as much heavy gear or waiting for satellite tracks and flyaways to show up. Again, it's all right here now in the palm of your hand. These shorter-term bureaus are more commonplace today. It allows us to cover more unfolding stories without the huge costs associated with maintaining permanent bureaus. The high rents, the satellite infrastructures, all of this has now been replaced by hotels and Wi-Fi. With the technology today and the new lighter gear and the easier travel, it is actually easy for us to get places faster and to deliver the news quicker, as it's all right here in the smartphone, in the palm of your hands. And in the last few years, all of this has significantly changed the way we cover the news. In fact, in 2011, our chief news anchor, Lisa LaFlamme, anchored a live newscast from Cairo's Tahrir Square, all with a little box we call a Dejero, the size of a small suitcase. We now have apps embedded in our smartphones that reporters just press. They go like this, and they are live on the air with Lisa LaFlamme. It's pretty amazing. We also have these in our iPads and laptops and Blackberries. As well, the news story itself has changed. The lifespan of a story today is so much faster because of social media and because of technology. A deadline is now. Now. It's constant. It's never ending. It's not just a 6 o'clock newscast or an 11 o'clock network newscast. As well, correspondents are now filing to every platform imaginable: a morning show, a noon show, a supper, a late night, a 24-hour news channel, and of course, online. It never ends. Feeds are easier, travel is quicker, and places are more accessible. Hence, the shorter bureau was born. In 2011, with the Arab uprisings in Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and Syria, everything began to change. If you remember, while foreign correspondents were reporting on the rooftops of hotels with their camera people by their side, there were citizens below, citizens tweeting, posting video to YouTube, and organizing themselves on Facebook. It all began to change, and change fast. Citizen journalism was born. We consume this conflict in a whole new way because citizens, each and every one of you, could now document news to the world alongside us institutional journalists. These eyewitness accounts don't necessarily help us understand the event, but they do bring us right to where the event is unfolding. But the question still remains, however, who you can trust and how to make sense of it all. And that's where we, as traditional media, play that role. We are still the most trusted source. I believe the future to be very bright for foreign news. I see a future with even more foreign journalists spanning the globe, where videographers, correspondents who can do it all, write, edit, shoot, file to all platforms, multimedia experts, as I like to call them, found out across the globe, filing instantaneously to all platforms, doing digital-first journalism. The next step is a new generation of even smaller cameras that are lighter and easier on shooters, and easier to conceal in harder places. And of course, the technology continues to evolve. We are currently exploring drone technology and uses for news. As well, now there are more places for consumers to get their foreign news. If it doesn't make the network newscast, there are so many other platforms for this journalism, so many. And moving forward, we must continue to adapt to the new technology, as this technology has transformed how we do our job, how we gather, and how we distribute the news. We must continue to shape the foreign desk of the future. In fact, we are actually doing more foreign news now at CTV News than we ever have, and the ability to get to air with smartphones and gyros has given us that flexibility, unimaginable a decade ago. And again, we are doing it on every platform imaginable. So consumers are actually getting more foreign news than ever before, and they are getting it faster and on any platform they want it. Moving forward, we are more committed than ever to foreign reporting. Canadian eyes all over the globe telling you stories with a Canadian perspective. And remember, the most important thing is that we are all storytellers, and telling these stories from around the world through Canadian eyes is still paramount. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Wendy. Moving on to David Walmsley now.
Thank you. I'm exhausted.
It's over now.
So, that sounds like a lot of hard work. The question of how important is it to have Canadian eyes is it's important that you have eyes that you employ. So they don't have to be Canadian, they have to be citizens of the world. And it's with delight that Mitch Potter is here tonight, who represents the Toronto Star, of course. Distinguished foreign correspondent. I think he spoke last year. And Mitch has a great line, which is when he's walking up the mountains in Afghanistan, or he's risking his life in another troubled area, he has yet to bump into the Google correspondent. And I think what that speaks to is the value and the cost of journalism. So the cost of our journalism is always to do with the dollars and the budgets, and on occasion the sacrifice of the people we work with. The budget at the Globe and Mail is untouched. I do not have the excuse of not having enough money. I have more than enough money. I have all the resources I could possibly want. The challenge is how you channel that in a proper fashion. And what you need to do is you need to employ and ensure that you're dealing with the individuals who are going to deliver the news that is not, and this answers, I suppose, the second question of what is our approach. It is not about the immediacy. That is not what the Globe and Mail stands for. I have a maxim that is for the newsroom both domestically and internationally, and that is, you ruin the day to improve the week, to make the month memorable. To make the month memorable requires the ability and the skill to refuse to do a specific story because it's in the headlines, knowing that within a month you'll come back with something much more fundamental, educational, and brave. And the people we hire to do that cannot possibly live to the hamster wheel. They have to belong with geographical biases, who reside in territories, regions, continents, but who also recognize that while their currency is profile, their memorability will be the ultimate test of their success. And the interconnection that we have with respect to how individuals see the world in what is, yes, a fast-paced environment and indeed in many ways a smaller country begins at home. So foreign news is actually how it affects Canada, and that includes everyone from our recent reporting on an Ontario cabinet minister who CSIS believes to be under undue influence of a foreign government, through to the behavior of immigration, through to the behavior and the characteristics of Afghan refugees who have arrived in Canada, to the fact that Syrian refugees are not arriving in Canada, and what can be done about that. So the challenges are enormous. I don't have answers, but I look forward to the evening and the conversation that will probably address many of the bigger structural questions that I think you as the consumers will have. The internet, if it's taught us anything, is that the hierarchy and the monopoly of knowledge that's inherently an arrogant position enjoyed by editors around the world has been lost. And there's been a flattening in the environment whereby the reader, the viewer, the consumer in whatever environment it is can instruct us. So that's what I look forward to this evening. Thanks.
Thank you, David. And Lynn McAuley from the Toronto Star.
Thank you, Susan. In July 2011, the Star's publisher, John Cruikshank, and the editor, Michael Cook, approached me about rebooting our foreign coverage. And the way they put it to me was, we need a standalone, special premium Saturday world section, and we need broader coverage. And the way we're going to get that is by closing 2 bureaus. So it was a little counterintuitive for me. But the idea was to take the money from the 2 bureaus and pour it into a travel budget that would allow us to be more nimble, which we were not, more flexible in the news, which we were not, and to try and do this from Toronto. We reorganized, so we did close the bureaus. We did publish the World Weekly, which goes out every Saturday to home subscribers in the Star as a bonus as part of their subscription fees. And after 4 years, it's the 4th best read section. We know our readers really want international news. They're enthusiastic about it. We hear a lot about it from them, and it scores very high in all our reader surveys. What we also did, though, is we decided to reorganize our foreign coverage from geographic places to look at what we take into calling the global as local. So we look at different beats. So we have global health, which global health stories happen right across the world. So the specialty is that. Global economics, security, health, I mentioned health, science, and the environment. And so we were looking at those globally, and the assignments would come up and we would send people, those specialists to do that and have a base of excellent veterans in the home office, like Mitch, doing the sort of generalist specialist news, drawing on their years of experience. So how did that work out for us? We have maintained that budget. It's dropped a little bit, maybe 10% in the 4 years. But Star reporters have gone on 165 trips to 63 countries and 30 American states. The only reason I mention that is that it did give us that flexibility we wanted. We wanted to tell the stories that connect with readers in ways that perhaps the firefight of the day, which was what we were getting dragged into all the time, we didn't think was serving them, and they were telling us wasn't serving them in what they really wanted to know. So we re-upped our concept of what those stories might be. So we did things like we called it the clothes on your back. It rose out of the Rana Plaza tragedy in Bangladesh. And it was a story it was a series of stories that looked at right from child labor in the factory in Dhaka, right to the closet that the t-shirt lived in your home. And that touched a lot of people, partly because one of our reporters went undercover in Dhaka and worked as a worker, and her boss was 8 years old. We looked at remittances. Canadians sent $24 billion in 2013, remittances back to countries from where they came, which is an extraordinary number for any place, but it's the highest per capita in the world. We went to 3 countries, the Philippines, India, and Somalia, which is among the 3 highest where Canadians send that money, to see how that money was being spent and to show the connections. So we found a town in the Philippines where almost every single house has been rebuilt by money from remittances, many of them Canadian. We found the people in that house and where they live in Toronto, and we told that story about how that money goes back and forward. We looked at, last fall we did a major series on migrants, working with, I think we went to 4 different countries, El Salvador, the Mediterranean, Italy, Greece, and Thailand, which is where Mitch went. Because we knew there were 50 million people on the move, which has got to be a transformative moment for the world. And as we've seen in the last few months, it's become a crisis again this year. We went to Saudi Arabia to look at an engineering firm, a Canadian engineering firm that was helping re-engineer the traffic flow and the people in Mecca. for the Hodge. So we've been doing those kinds of stories that we think give us a better, that we believe, and because we know we're getting pretty good feedback on it. They're different, they're not just the firefighting, which we do. I'm not saying we don't. We did the Charlie Hebdo attack. We did go into the Central African Republic on the cusp of the, what the UN was predicting to be a genocide. We did go to Nigeria for the Chibok girls' kidnappings, and we were in Sierra Leone quite early for the Ebola outbreak. Which is all to say, we haven't cut back simply because we closed those 2 bureaus. We actually leveraged the money from those 2 bureaus to do more than what we were doing certainly before. Briefly, what's next for us? Just to mention, the Star Touch is actually a tablet, not a tabloid, and that's what we're launching, just so we're all clear. It's a tablet app, and it launches in the fall. So that is what we're working on. And I have to say, right now, we're in the middle. It will change our storytelling, and it already has. It demands much richer, smarter thinking. And foreign news fits very well into that because we can make it that rich experience that we haven't been able to do in print, like videos. And anyway, you have to experience it. It's that exciting. Also, I just want to say about foreign news on the app. Our readers, or the audience, the people we've surveyed so far as potential readers, they have a very high expectation for foreign news on the app. Many of them expect it to be there, and think it would be one of the reasons that they will download it. I think we have to get better at defining what those readers' expectations are. We have to balance the misery and mayhem and tragedy of the foreign file with stories of strivers and solvers. And I say that because many of our readers, we talk about Canadian eyes. Canadian eyes are very, very diverse now. They're very much, people look at the world from where they came as much as from where they are. And so they do want to, people who came from Brazil don't see it as just favelas. They see it as a different place to live. And I think that's a very important thing that we sometimes miss in our coverage that we're going to learn to explore. Victims and victories, not just victims, which is what we hear a lot of criticism about on foreign files. Want to learn from the competition. This has become a very, very crowded field in the last 18 months, I'd say. BuzzFeed, Vice, and Quartz have all opened bureaus. Quartz is moving into Africa in a very big way. BuzzFeed hired 34 foreign correspondents. Vice News has, I don't know how much money, I think it's $140 million to do amazing things sometimes. And they're very nimble, we can learn that. They're risk takers, we can learn that. They know their audience in a way that I don't think, certainly I don't think legacy or audience, news organizations know it as well, maybe broadcast, I can't speak for that, know their audience in the way these outlets do, and they're very ambitious. We can learn from that. Just other things we're going to look at doing, collaborating with fellowships and grants. Susan mentioned the Travers Grant Fellowship, and we worked with it this year, and we worked with the Atkinson to do the Syrian refugees last year.
Right. Okay, thank you. Now that ends the more formal part of things. I'd like all of our panelists to just jump in when I ask questions. We don't need to go down the row anymore. But I would like to pick up on the idea of the Canadian eyes. You, Wendy, mentioned also the Canadian perspective. How would you define Canadian perspective? There was a study done, was quite a while ago, a limited study, and found that the foreign correspondents didn't consciously bring a Canadian perspective to the stories that they told.
Well, I know that it's a rule that if you are a foreign correspondent at CTV News, you must be Canadian to give it that Canadian perspective from anywhere in the world. I don't know what it is at the rest of your papers or other places, but we want Canadians to be all over the world bringing a Canadian perspective. And I still think there is a strong Canadian perspective there.
What would that be?
Well, it depends what story they're covering.
One of the, again, maybe counterintuitive Canadian perspectives is to make sure that when you're in foreign countries, you're not simply looking for the Canadian story, right? I think Canadians are interested not just in things that are Canadian. So for every example, that I can find of a story where, for example, Nepal and Adrian Arsenault finding a Quebec paramedic, a story that really connected, particularly on social media, somebody who had been in Nepal for a number of years, helping out, and when the earthquake hit, decided to go back. So that's a traditional Canadian perspective on a story, and those work extremely well, and touched a nerve with Canadians. But for every example like that, I think of, again, an Adrian Arsenault example, going to cover the Ebola story in Liberia and making sure that we included Africans in the coverage, right? So where you saw 60 Minutes take some criticism for doing a full report in Monrovia without anybody but American people helping out. Adrian is and all of our reporters make very conscious effort to make sure that we're not simply being very sort of parochial and looking at the Canadian people involved. I think that is a hallmark of the reporting that we do overseas, is making sure that local people are included in the coverage, because that is important for Canadians to get that perspective. So it's a two-way street.
But we do spend a lot of time, finding Canadians in these regions and covering them as well.
David, is there more to it than that?
I think policy comes into it in terms of how Canadian government's presence overseas is considered. The lack of access to Canadian officials overseas is a big problem. We don't understand what the Canadian government position is often because there isn't an ability to talk to them. There are big questions around where does Ottawa's footprint stop, if it stops at all, and what is the best approach for trying to channel that and not turn it into a sort of a ping-pong game of politics. The real understanding for journalists in going into the field is to be appreciative of the challenges people are facing, and the greater the access, the better it is. That's why we all lean to having permanent positions and also having very enthusiastic individuals who will turn over every boulder that they're faced up against. But the challenge, I think, for now is one of trying to understand our role in the world. I think it's less of an issue of dealing with a major international human catastrophe, and instead challenging the most diverse country in the world and asking where it stands in the world, where does it see itself reflected in the world, and where does the reflection of the world looking back into Canada actually find a meeting point that fits with not only enunciated policy, but also the reality on the ground. And those are very difficult, complex issues that never get decided in a day. I'm not even criticizing the fact that we can't understand the policy. It's just a puzzle. We need to do a better job of figuring out where the position or the vision of Canada in the international world is.
Can you really dig into that sort of thing, though, if you aren't digging your foreign correspondents in as well and embedding them in the nations, the regions that they're covering?
Yeah, I get a lot of education from the foreign correspondents when they come back and they talk to me privately, but they're not, for whatever reason, very often able to get the information to the readers in a way that is in real time. The greatest work that our teams do is with the authority they have when they travel into regions that they've known for years. Mark McKinnon in Ukraine would be a great example, a world-leading journalist on one of the great challenges. He literally wrote the book 6 to 8 years before what happened. But where do we find the nexus that the Canadian foreign policy position is on the ground is one that seems to be almost invisible.
Jonathan, do you want to jump in there? You've addressed context as well as sending your correspondents in for shorter periods of time. How do they get at this nexus?
In a perfect world, you find a situation, as we did with Nala Ayed, where she's based in the Middle East, both for a period of time in Cairo and previously that in Beirut, and then something springs up in the region, as it happened with the Arab Spring. So you have somebody who's in the area, who's done a lot of work on that story already, and when it happens, is instantly able to bring you the perspective and the context on that story. Not speaking so much to the Canadian role in these things. I agree with David, it's sometimes hard to figure that out, but it's important to get that perspective from our people in the field. But that's, to me, how it works in a perfect world, and we've had some good examples of where that does actually happen, and Null is a good example where you station somebody, and it speaks to the importance of having people in the region. Obviously, with the Arab Spring, we also put in a bunch of people as the story got bigger, but having somebody there who was of the place for just the right amount of time to get a good sense of the context and a good sense of the people and the players, and able to instantly provide that analysis and context was important in that case.
How important is it that they're Canadians in those bureaus, or do you have a mix of correspondents who are actually from the countries in which your bureaus are placed?
No, like I said, we have all Canadians who are based in our foreign bureaus, even our camera people as well. Both are Canadians.
Because this isn't a model that's consistent, for example, in the US or with other networks
I don't know how they
elsewhere.
do it in the United States.
No, some American
Yeah, I
networks
think they are.
partner with
yeah,
British news organizations,
that's
for
right.
example. So yeah, it isn't the same everywhere.
And is it important, though, to have Canadians?
I mean, to the extent that it's possible, our correspondents would be, mainly Canadian, most from Canada, not so much necessarily with the with other staff in the bureaus, but to the extent that it's possible, sure. But it's not always possible. It's a big country. There are a lot of places in the world, and so we also rely on networks that we have and organizations that we work with to provide on-the-ground people to provide us with stories as well. So it's a mix. Obviously, preferably it's people of the place, but that isn't always possible.
And what do you lose when you don't have that?
If you don't have a Canadian? I don't know if you lose a lot. For us, what we want to do is ensure that the people that we have hired to the Globe and Mail are able to do the job overseas. So it's merit-based. I don't think it's a birth issue.
Well, I think, for us, if they're, our audience is Canada, and they usually, like Jonathan said earlier, we're finding, if, depending on where we are, we're looking for Canadian stories usually. Of course, you have to find a balance, but we're reporting back to a Canadian audience, so they do bring a Canadian perspective.
Now, you mentioned technology. Everyone really has, but Wendy, you've really talked about how technology has changed the way CTV does its operations. Do you think that it's changed to such an extent that the days of the foreign correspondent who dug into a country and stayed there for several years, moved right in, are those days gone?
It depends, and depends what you're covering. When we were when the Canadian troops were in Kandahar, we were there for many, many years. If something like that happened again, we would probably go in there. We would open a bureau for many, many, many years, depending on what the story is. I do think it makes it a lot easier, though, to, I guess, parachute into a story and spend a less amount of time there, because it's a lot easier now to travel, and you have this, and we're filing stories from this. You're not lugging all the heavy gear and the satellite dish and waiting for trucks to show up and, all the permanent stuff that used to come with that. But it also allows us to do more and to cover more foreign news and to get there faster and get it on the air quicker and get it into this faster.
What do you lose when you parachute?
Well, I think, I think it's a balance. Depends how long you're in there for. Sometimes you're in and out, sometimes you spend a very long time there. And if we felt that we needed to open up a permanent bureau there, we would, depending on what the story is. So we're always judging.
I think there's a benefit. We walked away from Jerusalem because the story became so cyclical that you couldn't actually make head nor tail of it. And the reason we did it 5 years ago would have concerned specifically the Israeli authorities. I think that they would have felt we were becoming detached from what they feel is really an existential issue. And today there is certain relief that we're not in Jerusalem, because the Jerusalem story tells the same story. So I declined to send for the Israeli election. But what I've done is I've sent in to Israel now, because I think that's going to educate us in a much better way than the horse race of this person won or that person won. It also gives us the opportunity to tell the stories of science and innovation in Israel. It gives us the opportunity to tell the stories of water and the issues of drought which are fundamental questions that are going to come home to Canada. In terms of the budgets and in terms of Canadians reporting it, I think that's less important than the context of understanding the Canadian footprint internationally. So we've got an opening at the moment for a California bureau. So why am I opening a California bureau? It's because if you look by population, it's probably the 5th or 6th largest province in Canada is California. You get 500,000 in LA and you've got 350,000 Canadians in the Valley. They have a huge loyalty, they have a huge engagement on IP addresses back into Canada. They care about the sport, they care about the weather, they care about what Aunt Beryl in Belleville is doing. They return home, it's plausible to return home. You can tell those stories, but you can also tell the stories of how California can teach Canada and instruct Canada on where perhaps it can go wrong when it comes to, specifically in Waterloo, technology and startups. There are a lot of different environments that we can introduce. Now, whoever gets that position, it's not that relevant to me that they have lived for the last X number of years in Canada or that they're Canadian per se. They just have to have the merit to tell that story.
How do all of you choose where you're going to focus your resources? David, of course, has lots, so he doesn't have to worry about this as much, but what about the rest of
Limitless,
you?
I think you said, David.
Yes,
limitless
limitless funds.
I have no concern about the budget. Maybe I'm just reckless.
This isn't cooking, right?
So domestically, I've tripled my staff in Alberta this year because it's the political and economic story of the year. Politically, notly, economically, structural or a cyclical oil price decline. So I've done that, and that's a permanent staff increase. Makes sense to me. My biggest bureau, domestically,
No, internationally.
is Vancouver because we're becoming a Pacific nation. So my Asia Pacific correspondent is based in Vancouver. Why? Because I don't want him based in pick a country, Malaysia, Indonesia, Japan. Because if you do that, you end up getting Japanese, Malaysian, Indonesian stories. If I have them in Vancouver and I commit a very significant budget so he can travel, then he goes to Indonesia for the very focused story. He goes to Malaysia, he goes to Japan for those very focused stories. And then he comes home and he reminds himself and the readers about what he's learned. So that is a foreign bureau based in Vancouver. That's an example.
What about the rest of you?
We're always looking at bureaus where we have them. We're always contemplating new ones, closing, moving.
How do you make those decisions, though?
It depends where the news is. You know, currently, we have a Jerusalem bureau, but there's no one in it at the moment. We just have a producer there. London is a hub. We move, and a lot of people from London all the time. We keep 2 reporters, 2 correspondents there, and they move around a lot to the Middle East, other parts of Europe. Washington, D.C., of course, is a hub. We have a bureau in Los Angeles. We've had one for over 10 years. We also have a bureau in China. But we're always looking at stuff. We're always deciding. We used to have a bureau in Kabul, and when the Canadian troops left, we closed it. We may open up another one. You know, we were thinking maybe we should be opening up one in Turkey. So we're always having these considerations.
Always looking for the Canadian
Where the
insert?
stories are.
Jonathan?
Yeah, it's where the stories are. We did a 4 or 5 month bureau this winter in Istanbul in Turkey, which seemed like a good idea to us and worked out actually really well for us. The timing was good. We put Coxhill in there who had background in language and who knew the story and delivered a lot of good content from that bureau from that period. So we targeted that as a place that things were going to happen, and it turned out well. We also we were in Africa for 3 or 4 months this winter as well. So it really is where the story is for sure. It's the main kind of driver of what we do. And I conversations that we have now about where we'll open up these short-term bureaus also really revolve around where's the opportunity in digital. So Susan is someone who's worked for the national or for the more traditional broadcast outlets. You know what the appetite is from foreign. It's really news-based. It's based. The parameters are quite tight and clear to people. So we look for places where, in the absence of breaking news or traditional breaking news that would make it through the broadcast lens, where can we put people who can tell stories on digital that will have a resonance with the audience? And Turkey, we thought was a good idea, and it turned out to be a very good choice in terms of where could we do content that wouldn't necessarily land on the National or the World at 6 or World Report, but would do well in digital, and that certainly was a place that we had some success with.
Now, how do you gauge what people want? As Lynn pointed out, it's a diverse country. People come from all over, they have different interests.
Well, I mean, it's certainly easier now in digital. There's instant understanding of what people want and what people are interested in, unlike broadcasts where it's a little more difficult. I know for those of us who were around when people meters came into being, there was a time when executives would take a look at the 17-minute mark of the program and kind of go, there was a story on the Paris Opera there, we're never going to do a story again on Paris or the opera because the numbers dropped at 17 minutes after, and that's not a way to run a newsroom, but there's definitely more, you get instant feedback now in digital in terms of people who's sharing it, who's looking at it, and so it's a pretty good way of understanding what makes sense and what works. So certainly metrics in digital are instant for you and understanding where the audience is.
Yeah, we have a team. It used to be gut, used to be instinct, it used to be experience, and that was the sole arbiter. Today we have a team of PhD data analysts who work with us. And it's a 50-50 split, gut, experience, eye, they're still very much part of it, but because the Globe and Mail is a paywall, we have an understanding when people subscribe to the information that interests or that either disproportionately is rewarded or is not as well rewarded. And the key in these things in understanding the true value of the content based on a bunch of different demographics, those who subscribe, those who maybe only visit once a day, those who maybe visit once a month, those who only visit because social media has brought the story in front of them and it's once in a lifetime, are all important educational facets that we can interpret how we then deliver the news beyond. One of the really interesting aspects is removing bias. And I don't mean that in the journalistic sense, but in terms of the placement of the story. So when we only had a newspaper, or in the linear environment of broadcast where you've got the top story and you're going down through the 9 stories that you have, there's a bias in that. You've chosen to give more love to one story than to another. Why is that on any given day? Sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's not. And what we're doing is we're removing the bias to understand the true value of the content, so that the value of the content is based less on the love that we've given it by saying digitally top of the homepage, or we promoted it specifically on a social media environment. We would continue to do those, but recognizing instead that perhaps just as in a supermarket where you have the cookies that are at eye level and you grab those, does that mean the cookies below that level are not as good or they were being promoted? We're removing the bias of that in order to find out the true value of our content, and that will make us more honest as journalists and as editors to say that our gut actually needs to be tweaked a little bit because the data analysts have shown us that there's a greater reward for material that we've always done, but we hadn't necessarily promoted.
Lynn, we haven't heard from you in a while.
No, that's right. We do a lot of what David's talking about. We've done it in print for the last 9 months, where we've had people read individual stories and give us their opinion of them, which is can be a actually soul-destroying experience.
Why?
Well, only because when you think you've poured your heart and soul into something. We thankfully don't post these anywhere publicly, and someone says, "No, I didn't read that past paragraph 4," and it's so we don't. But it does help editors understand what is valued, which is why I was saying earlier that we know that the stories about solvers and strivers over victims tend to, you can see this in their comments where they're saying, I've read this story before, it's the same story about this happening. Now this is this group of, it's a fairly substantial group of readers that say these things. So that was the other thing. And we have done other kinds of survey, I don't know, yeah, surveys, I guess is what they're, polls and surveys with readers that will, where we get very clear answers that there are as much of there as they are of here. That doesn't mean they aren't Canadian citizens and they're not of here, but their concerns about where they've come from are very deep for them as well, which I think is also just reflected in that number of remittances. I mean, they do very much care about back home.
What other surprises have your analytics showed? Because international coverage has been referred to as broccoli sometimes. It's something people always say that they want. They don't always
Right.
take it in. Because they say they want it because they think maybe it's good for them. But what are your, what's your data showing?
Well, you go ahead.
For us, the quality test is really pretty self-evident. When you do a story, we can measure the time people spend on it. And it depends who you talk to in the industry about what sort of level you want to get to. 3 minutes for an article, which I think is to Lynn's point, how heartbreaking that is for a reporter or an editor, 3 minutes, whoop-de-doos. But if you can get to 3 minutes, you've done well with traction. With us, religiously, we're hitting 12 minutes with very significant material that is foreign. And that is just the text. If you add in then video and you add in visuals through stills, you add in further commentary, question and answers, panels, events, you get a stickability that I think we're very reassured by, that there is a level of sophistication and interest that goes far beyond any parochial nature that foreign news is not considered to our readership certainly as it's good for us, so we better consume it. It's instead, I think, seen as one of the key retention factors for people who come to the Globe and Mail, and all our data analysts would show that it's absolutely critical to that.
And for us, it's obviously ratings and what people watch, and also for online, we know when a story gets traction because it's shared on Facebook, it's tweeted, and it's the likes and the amount of people that come to the story on the page.
Any surprises?
Well, sometimes you would expect something to be a lot bigger and it isn't, but it usually when we think a story resonates, it usually does.
Jonathan?
I guess I would just say that what strikes me is the kind of agnostic nature of some of the research around digital, in that it can often just come down to a good story, and so the borders and subject areas and things that we've thought about so deeply over the years in many ways don't matter as much anymore, and you'll see people flock to a story because it's just interesting and or it's got a good headline, or it's actually hard in some ways, right? For sure, the metrics are incredible, but there really is, it's hard to pin down exactly where, what region of the world or what topic area is going to attract a huge audience, because it really is just good storytelling can often just move things up really quickly.
And is it
Or a great picture. I was watching
Picture,
the
sure,
BBC yesterday, and their #1 story was a raccoon riding an alligator in Florida. I don't know if anyone saw
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
but it was the most looked at.
Yeah.
And it really was a raccoon on an alligator
But
that
was it
someone
dead?
took a picture of.
Someone said it was dead.
So there you
I don't
go.
know. Discuss.
Does the parachute kind of international coverage, as critics say, lead to just the conflict, just the negative stories, and nothing that's sort of long, sustained kind of journalism that lends some understanding to another part of the world, as well as Canada's role and place in the world?
Sorry, the first part of that I didn't hear. Does parachute
The
journalism?
parachute not having an established foreign bureau where people do spend a long time on the ground.
Well, I can only tell you about Michelle Shepard, who's the national security reporter at the Star, who I think has spent more time in Somalia than any other Canadian journalist, only because of the number of time, I think just the number of years she's been on the beat. But not only that, she's very committed to the story. And when I said 2011, and some of those trips, 6 of those were to Somalia. And she has got some amazing reporting out of that story, both for the Toronto Somalian community, and that are very engaged in that story in particular, on the terror, Al-Shabaab and the kids who've gone over to join it, and just the investment that Canada has made in the country. She also did some amazing work on it was called Somalia, Where Famine is a Crime, which was just looking at the amount of aid that had gone, humanitarian aid, that had gone into Somalia and where it ended up and why there was such a critical famine in that country. She also went, I think, over the course of time, 26 times to Gitmo, to cover the Omar Khadr story. And you saw where she ended up just a couple of weeks ago with the exclusive interview with Omar. So I don't think, she doesn't live in Gitmo, and she doesn't live in Somalia. We also have a reporter, Ravina Alak, who has been several times to India. I think if you have people who are that committed to a story and you let them go, I'm not sure that you get, I mean, are they parachuted in at that point? So I don't think that that's...
Yeah, I think to
Yeah.
follow up on that, it depends who you're parachuting in, and to get back to the point I made at the beginning. I mean, I'm incredibly fortunate to have in our newsroom a number of people who we could, to use the term parachute, into places, but who've got incredible experience in foreign reporting, who've got expertise in different parts of the world and a real ability and background in the craft, either by just doing it a lot or by having lived, in some cases, 3, 5, 10 years in places. So, you know, parachuting someone who is mostly covering something else could be problematic and an issue, but in terms of the people that many of us have in our newsrooms who have the expertise, it's certainly very comfortable in doing that and knowing that the content will be excellent. I also think as the content shifts over time, and we're just seeing the beginnings of where this is going, most of our broadcast properties are still pretty traditional, and that will change whether we like it or not. You know, the parachuting aspect will become part of a larger journalistic effort, which may not look exactly as it does today. So we may, you know, the person we have on the ground, who is our eyes and ears on the ground, will be just one part of how we're covering something. We'll be doing it by, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, by, you know, taking a look at what's being said in social media, photos people are sending, what video people are sending. I mean, we have to verify that, but, you know, in the future, having those eyes and ears on the ground may just be part of a more holistic strategy around covering a story. So I think it's for sure, it has its value, will continue to have its value.
And like Lynn was saying, you know, in the end, you know, our correspondents are storytellers. And a good story, no matter what, and good content will always have someone, a consumer, consuming that. So it doesn't matter whether they've been parachuted in or they've been there for years, you know, it's all about the story and the storytelling.
Okay, just hold that thought there. We are going to open it up now to questions from the audience. So there are microphones at both sides here. And while everyone's getting into place, just very quickly, it's not the parachuting, it's the impact of the parachuting. Critics say it tilts the balance. So it's more reactive journalism as opposed to journalism that lends itself to a more thoughtful understanding of the world.
So you're sort of saying if you go into Africa every time there's some coup, then you're only ever showing Africa as a country of coups. Yes, I can see that, but that's a question of judgment and what you would choose to do, not necessarily, not necessarily the way you would normally. I mean, we wouldn't do that. I don't think anyone here does that.
You know, when David's answered how he's dealt with that in the context of Israel, and I
Yeah.
think, and for us it was, you know, committing to Turkey not because of an election there as well, but because of just an ongoing interest in that country and committing for more than a week or 2 weeks. I think natural disasters will always be a tendency, which just makes logistical sense to do that. But beyond that, no, I agree, it's not, it's problematic.
There's a greater flexibility too, where previously we would be in London or you'd be in Moscow, or if you were part of the French service, you'd be in Paris. We're currently in Berlin for 18 months because the German story is one we absolutely have to cover. So I've given up a New York position for Berlin. Don't miss New York at all. I will in the next few months as the US election gets going. I'll have to think up something else. But there's a flex, and I think there's been a change. If you were to audit what we are saying tonight compared to what our counterparts would have said a decade ago, we would have all fought blue bloody murder to say never again, no way, we have to have absolutely structured foreign bureaus, parachute, they dilute everything we're supposed to be. That was a defensive position because we didn't want to lose budgets. I think this is actually a more honest position, which is the editorial decisions, the stories allow us, with the technology that Wendy talks about, the flexibility to move to where we have to be.
Okay, thank you. We're going to move to questions now. Let's start over here. Tell us your name and have a question that's a question. Tell us who, actually, you'd like to direct your question to, if there's someone specific.
Okay, it's James Skidmore, and pardon me, it's a question to all of you, but maybe to Wendy in particular, because you'd said at one point, well, it doesn't matter if they're you know, parachuted in or been there for a while on a foreign location. I'm not sure that you, like, what I haven't heard you folks say or respond to is how it feels to us consumers who might have a particular interest in a particular region or particular knowledge to hear things that just seem so off. In my case, for example, I'm professionally involved in Germany and I've lived in Germany. So when I hear announcers or reporters not even able to pronounce the chancellor's name correctly, then I think to myself, well, what knowledge do they actually have of the situation there? And it's not so much just the on the ground or telling the stories, but what about the knowledge of the history, the politics, the societal information that I don't imagine you can get if you're trying to file every day and you're off then on the next story and this sort of thing. So I'd like to hear you respond to that, because I think you haven't sort of said anything about your consumers who, when they hear these things, maybe they get turned off when they're, that's not exactly right or not ringing true. So I'd like to hear you respond to that. Thank you.
Well, I would hope that any foreign correspondent that we send anywhere, if they were in Germany, would absolutely know how to pronounce names properly. It's one of my pet peeves. I can't stand when that happens. But yeah, when our people are on the ground in a region, they learn it, depending on how long they are there. These are experts, and they spend a lot of time, and they reach out to people who are there. We call them fixers. I know someone had mentioned minders, who help them, and translators, and they spend a lot of time, even though they may be there for a month or 3 months or 3 years. They know the country they're going to. They spend a lot of time researching it and really learning it. So even if they are going in for a short time, they're studying it and learning it before they get there. So I would hope they would know how to pronounce the right things.
Does it make them too dependent, though, on either their fixers
It depends.
or
It
on
depends
official
where. It
spokespeople?
depends where they're going. Some regions you need that.
Yeah, I can't disagree with that. I think that's not just an issue in foreign reporting. It's an issue, I'm sure, when airline pilots or lawyers or engineers watch newscasts, they're often struck with the lack of deep understanding in how we frame things. And so, we do our best to mitigate against that, but I won't deny it as an issue for sure. But there's also, I think, a balancing, having said that it's extremely important to have people long enough in a situation to understand what you're talking about and to make sure that you sound like you know what you're talking about. There's also something that we think about in domestic coverage, which is, are you in a place too long to understand what might be of interest to somebody outside that area? And that's something we struggle with too. So there are many examples that we probably all have of cases where someone's lived somewhere too long, both domestically or foreign, and doesn't really see it as something terribly interesting. So it's a bit of a struggle in both ways. I mean, being of a place for a long, long time can also lead to a blind spot around things that happen outside of obvious breaking news, planes falling out of skies, things blowing up. Just things that are interesting and might be kind of fascinating for people outside that country. So it's a bit of a balancing act, but I have sympathy for that. I think it's hard. It's hard sometimes to be experts in everything.
That's a good
But it's
point.
balancing.
We do try to move people around a lot, and that they're not in one place for a long time, because sometimes they do miss things because they're so used to seeing them all the time, whereas someone new would see it differently.
Okay, let's
I
go
hope
over
we
here.
answered your question.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mike Gentile. I want to make a couple comments before I ask my question. And the first one being, I want to thank you. It's a real treat and an honor to learn from you, to listen to what you have to say, because you are knowledgeable and experienced. And thank you very much again for the information and the knowledge you bring to us as Canadians. My next comment is related to something along the lines of, I've been of opinion for a long, long time. The more we know about the others and the less we know about us, the greater advantage we have. You may or may not agree to that, but I think that makes a lot of sense. In addition to that, my question related to this is, as I look around the room, it's an interesting demographic. There's a lot of us here with a lot of gray hair. I don't see too many really young people. So my question is related to, where do you see, and as a panel as a whole, I know it's kind of evenly split because we have electronic media and we have print media. Where do you see the future as it relates to maybe perhaps the millennials? Where are you going with this? What do you think we can do?
Good question. Who wants to jump in?
I'm happy to start. That's something we discuss every day in our newsroom. How do we attract younger people, millennials? I have a 19-year-old. He does not watch the CTV news. Mom, I will never watch your news. No. If it was on Snapchat, he would watch my news. So that's something we struggle with all the time, and we're actually looking right now at starting this sort of sub-news service, so stay tuned. And, that's something we struggle with all the time. However, we have noticed on linear television that our ratings, 18 to 39, have actually increased this year. So who says millennials aren't watching traditional TV? They are, every now and then, tuning in. I believe they still will tune in to a big story. They still will tune into live events. We see this all the time. I also think it's important to get the kids when they're young, to get them in the schools, to try to be on Snapchat, to try to do more of that, so that when they are older, like me, they will tune to more linear. So this is something that we are always doing. We just announced yesterday we've joined forces with Facebook for our election, the coming up election, because we believe that's another way to get millennials to watch CTV News. So this is something we struggle with every day.
Okay, thank you. We'll go over here now. Your name, your question, and is there someone you'd like to direct your question to?
Neil Desai, my question is in a similar vein, but it's for the print side of the table. I find myself, largely because of social media, looking at a lot of third-party perspectives of global issues. So, a British perspective on what's going on in Ukraine, what the Americans are saying about the Indian election. Is that something you're finding from your content? Is your readership getting more global? Is that an opportunity for your business?
Yes, it is getting more global. I'm not sure about an opportunity for our business. You mean getting those points of view into the star from third part, like other people and other voices? I just missed that part of the back end.
Getting more viewers, monetizing it, whatever you define as success.
Well, money. So, yeah. If it could certainly be a part of what we could do. I just don't know exactly where to go with it. I know that on the tablet that we're developing now and we're working on, there will be a completely different experience for people who are digital natives, frankly. So that will be different. I don't know, though, I don't know. I'm just
This
going
is
to be
actually
honest.
a good time to go to a question from one of our online viewers. Justin from Kitchener wants to know, to what extent does online data influence resourcing for global news coverage? And I'd like to start with David on that one.
Yeah, it comes back to the data analysis that we do in terms of resourcing global news coverage. You cannot go on a metric that's a daily, a weekly, or a monthly. You've got to go with something that has a broader theme to it. I would actually answer it, I suppose, in a similar way to the question that Neil posed, and that is the homepage is becoming less of an important landing page, and instead there are an awful lot more side doors, which are social media, which fit the millennial appetite, they fit the foreign appetite through various feeds, and they also instruct us in terms of what sort of a story is working. We're in Berlin because of the economic story. Do we think we're going to be able to monetize that based on German readers or readers outside of Canada looking at our look at Germany? No. We're looking at Germany because we think that's important for the Canadian audience. We're fundamentally about it being a Canadian organization that will tell international and domestic news from a national perspective. So the global data that's offered to us in terms of where people visit us from can only be a very small part of the full pie.
Okay, let's go over here now.
Hello, my name is Shannon Coulter. I just wanted to point out first, I'm 19-year-old myself, and I watch the national news each night. So there are different...
Which one, CBC or CTV?
I alternate.
Okay, that's okay.
Back to my question, it would be to all of you on the panel, actually. As a journalism student myself, one of our main topics in class is discussing this evolving journalism world. So with social media coming in, with digital media coming in, it's the evolution of journalism these days is what we're really focusing on. So I'd like to hear your perspective of what you think we should be doing to train our future journalists so that they can enter the new journalism world and be fully prepared.
Let's start with Wendy on that one.
Well, like I said, you have to be a multimedia tasker. You have to be able to do everything. You have to be able to shoot, edit, write, especially, be able to go live, be able to file to the digital, be able to write a blog, be able to, do it all. Kind of like a Swiss Army knife. And if you're able to do that, you're going to be a winner. And you have to be curious about the world.
I would just add, and maybe make it a little less onerous. A little less. I mean, I think if you wanted to make a list now of sort of 30 things that you need to do in this business right now, we all build bureaus, sometimes one-person bureaus, sometimes two, sometimes three, and domestic bureaus as well. You're not going to fill those bureaus or those teams with people that can do 30 things. So you're probably going to find someone who can do 13, and you have to find someone who can do the other 17. So it really is that kind of a, to be fair to people, it's pretty hard to be an expert at everything. But really, making yourself indispensable by learning as many of those skills as possible is absolutely what you should do. And I would just echo that writing is key. Anything we've talked about here, at least in my mind, it all comes back to writing and storytelling. So no matter what the platform is, that's a really key thing to understand and do well at.
I would say it's something slightly different, and that is you need to have an iron core where you're prepared to be alone. If you're with the pack, you're probably doing it wrong. So it doesn't mean you're lonely, but it means you're alone, and you have to be happy with that. And very few are.
Excellent words. Very good words.
I'm
Let's go
very
over here
alone.
now.
My name is Paul Tortolo. Tonight, several references have been made to the increased use of digital devices to get the news and get it out, especially leading to the democratization of journalism, that anyone can participate. When you consider that the news, the information that comes to people in your profession needs to be disseminated quickly, does that worry you? Does that need, that possibility of misinformation coming to you? How do you vet that?
Yes, it does worry me because it happens so quickly today. We have a 24-hour news channel. It's constant, and yes, it does worry us, but we have very strong things in place where things are vetted. We still make sure everything is sourced doubly so that stuff does not go on the air accidentally and wrong. They're never going to remember you were number one if you got it wrong, but they're always going to remember you got it wrong.
Okay, this works quite well with the question from Kasia in Oshawa, who wants to know pretty well the same thing, so maybe you can go into some more detail here. As world news breaks on social media, how do you vet foreign stories without having people on the ground?
Well, I mean, larger news organizations have full teams devoted to that specifically. In our case, it's groups of people, obviously not a massive team as you might find at the BBC, who I believe have a large group devoted to that specific work. But it is really about cross-checking, looking at your other sources, because social media is not the only input that we have. We subscribe to various news services, so it is about checking and finding people who can do that really well. There are also organizations that do that, and you can subscribe to who also make their business model is actually checking and looking at things and trying to figure it out. I mean, one of the interesting things that struck me in the last 10 years is that we have not through any organization or any plan, we've created an ad hoc wire service in this country and other countries that everyone gets for free, right? I mean, if you look, not so much now, but when it first started coming out, Twitter, most people following news sites were people from other news organizations, and you'll still see them in there, but now obviously the universe has expanded. But that's also a way to, we're always checking each other and following each other. So there are things in place, as Wendy says. Sometimes things get through and we make mistakes, but we're fairly rigorous around what we put out and what we don't put out. And we understand that there are people who are deliberately trying to deceive us now, right? So there's that to contend with as well.
Lynn?
I don't actually have much to add to what Wendy and sorry,
Jonathan.
Jonathan, yeah, have said, I would say we're very conservative about it, especially putting things online. We would rather just be late and just hold off until we know, until
So,
we're completely satisfied with
we feel
something
the
else.
same way.
We just can't. First of all, we have no way really of checking beyond, 4 people said it on Twitter. Oh, no, now 8, so it's truer. So
And
no,
in
we
the
don't.
end, all you have is your credibility.
Yeah, so we're just very conservative.
Authenticity and integrity are critical to it, but one of the interesting aspects to the second part of the question is whether or not, if you don't have people on the ground, what do? We've actually removed freelance. We will not put freelance into dangerous positions that we wouldn't put staff into, because with that there's a moral responsibility of a kidnapping that could last many years, and it's not something we're prepared to do. So I think that raises a question that hasn't yet come up, which is that the world has become a little bit reduced. We're not able to get to some very important stories because of the dangers unless we commit our staff, which we do, but it's in a very limited way because the threats and our capacity to not only shield the staff from the threats, but also to create environments, should a kidnapping happen, that would allow for us to have an infrastructure in place permanently until that was resolved. It's a very different business now where journalists are specifically targeted to be murdered.
There's no question, though, that the pressure is much greater now. I don't think we can kid ourselves around that. I was in the control room for the Air France crash. I don't know if anyone remembers that at Pearson a number of years ago. And you'll remember the video of that crash was a plane engulfed in flames, sitting in a gully. And one of our producers on scene phoned in to say that they had it verified that there was nobody was hurt. And it didn't seem logical seeing the pictures and hearing that, and we decided not to report it. Because remember, it's not just about credibility and about being right all the time. It's also worrying about who's watching, understanding that there could be people watching who've got family and relatives and friends on that plane, and to make that statement on the air and then have to retract it later has a different meaning than just around your personal or the brand's credibility. So, but if the same thing happened today, I'm not sure. I think it's a different world now. So I think we do have to recognize that the pressures are definitely greater than they were just whatever that was 7 or 8 years ago.
So you publish.
A lot of us get around it or can get around it by just talking about reports, right? Mm-hmm. And I think we use that as an excuse sometimes. Even around the Ottawa shooting, there was some of that was happening, and that is because of the pressure, and people are getting information from all kinds of places now, and not just from us. So there certainly is there's definitely a pressure now, and see where it goes. But it's hard to manage sometimes.
We attribute to the Globe.
Right. That's right.
Let's go over here.
I'm Isaac Wright, and just for the record, I'm 18 and I still get in my morning and evening news every day, so I'm one of the minority at my age.
Right.
My question is actually going to tie in very well to what Lynn said, and it's how, especially when we try to get more young people looking at information, and especially in the age of instant information and social media, how do we convince people that maybe for reliable, good analysis, they might have to wait a little bit, that maybe they can't go off of the first thing they see on Twitter, or if news starts launching into something like Snapchat, like Wendy was talking about, how do we convince them that maybe for reliable, better information, they might have to wait a little bit?
Convince who? Sorry. Convince
mostly young people, but
consumers.
People that are, your audience and people mostly here are utilizing instant information more and more.
Well, I would hope they would find out how many times they were wrong when they believed something that was wrong. It would convince them. I don't know how else you can convince them except by just proving the facts.
I think what helps today, though, is if you do put it on the air quickly, say on a 24-hour news channel, you can point to the web where they can go dig deeper and do more journalism on the web like your tablet's doing, get deeper in with more video, more substance, more data. Is that what you're saying? Because we do a lot of that.
Or are you wondering, how do you convince people to maybe take a step back and wait for some verified facts rather than getting a series of tweets that could be wrong?
Yeah. More like that.
Sorry, do you want to go? No, I was just thinking about, remember the Boston bomber when Reddit decided they were going to get the guy who did it, and it wasn't the guy who did it, and they posted his picture. There were a lot of very, very remorseful Reddit users after that who vowed they would never do that again. And I'm sorry to say it, but I think it's that kind of learning. I can't think of any other way that it might work, if it's wrong and you still believe it, I don't know how to convince you that it's wrong.
I think the industry lives in this terrible paradoxical environment where it takes professional pride in making everything look very smooth and simple. We love that. That looked easy. Without carrying through the second half of that responsibility, which is that there's an enormous cost to the journalism you do if you dedicate somebody or a group of people to a 10-month investigation. There's a cost to that, but there's also a value to it. And when you present that final investigation, I think it's very important. We've realized that it's important you tell the story of what that 10 months meant. You interviewed 35 different people, only 12 of whom ultimately appear in the piece, because the other 18 that fell on the cutting room floor either were not of use or they invalidated an argument. That is as valuable in journalism, proving the negative, as the final piece that's produced. But as an industry, we've been appalling at telling that. So what I introduce now on our set pieces, our franchise plays, is a backstory or field notes, which allows for people to read in, understand the methodology behind it, so people can get a sense of the cost that we did put into it, but also that there is a value. And that is something that is greater than the instant social media hit.
Okay, let's go over here.
Hi there, great discussion tonight. My name is Eva Salinas. I'm the managing editor of a foreign policy site, opencanada.org, and we get a lot of questions that we have over the past year about Mexico, and often comments, or whenever we publish a story on Mexico, it seems to be a place that justifies coverage in terms of the Canadian connections, interests. It's also a really complex place that would justify a longer period of time for a reporter to be there or sent often. So my first question is just, is that a debate that's happened in your newsroom? And if it's been dismissed, or if you feel that it is a place that gets turned down sometimes as not justifying coverage, why that might be? And second to that, similarly, are there other blind spots, if you will, that if you had all the financial resources that for whatever reason, security reasons or other reasons, perhaps access to Canadian government, that you're not sending correspondence and you wish you were? Iraq, Syria. So yeah, thank you.
I'll just
Let's
jump
start
in.
with the first
Sorry.
one.
Yeah, so Mexico, we used to have a correspondent in Mexico years ago, so there has been a commitment over time to cover that country. We should do more there. We're probably there once a year. We just came back and did a story a couple of days ago on the auto industry there. But some of the issues there do revolve around cost and around security. It's, I think where we were, Monterey area was fine, but if you're going to stray very far in that country right now, it's extremely expensive. The kidnapping risk is very high, and the costs are just are quite high. But it's a fair comment. We should be there more, but we do try to get there once a year at least.
It's the same with us. We used to have a bureau in Mexico City, same thing. We do go there a lot, mostly from our Los Angeles bureau, but it's the same thing, it's very costly. But we will, we usually go a few times a year, but we're not there permanently.
Let's get to your second question now. What have you not covered that you should have or wish you did?
For us, we used to have a bureau in Africa, and, I think for us, that's been a big miss for us. Would love to spend more time there. We hope to. We don't spend enough time in Africa.
I mean, we were in Africa with a pocket bureau for much of the last year. We also went to Liberia as well for Ebola. But even with that commitment, Boko Haram, for example, it was again a security. We talked a lot about that, but the security issues around that are horrendous, obviously. And so that's a spot that's difficult.
Yeah, and it's interesting for both Wendy and John, the missing sense of Africa. We're in Africa, and we have a correspondent who's been in many different countries over the last 20 years. He hasn't been home, and he has covered Ebola and Boko Haram. So it's funny, that would be a never-ending question. There's no easy answer, because so I can do those stories, but there's always another one, there's always another one, there's always another one. I regret not having a full-time Moscow bureau. I've got McKinnon in London, who can absolutely tell the story as well as anyone, but you know, it's very often the story with hindsight that you realize you had regret for. You didn't see it coming. I wish we could be in Riyadh permanently, like Saudi Arabia. The Saudi Arabia and Alberta story would be a great one to tell. I would love to be in Denver, Colorado. I think it's got a really interesting range around the axis. And is the United States a foreign bureau or not, right? Discuss. And I think I would love to be in the 11 Chinese cities, all with more than 5 million people or 10 million people. You know, what a story they have to tell. What a middle class they've created, you know, never mind Tom Mulcair. You know, look at China. It's extraordinary. So, it's never ending.
Good question, and Canadian media certainly have been criticized for the lack of a presence in Africa beyond the globe. Let's go to Kevin from Kitchener, who wants to know, what degree of autonomy do foreign correspondents have? How is the story decided, especially when a producer isn't on the ground? Lynn, why don't we start with you?
We discuss all the stories we're going to before anyone goes. So I don't, autonomy, I'm assuming that means do foreign correspondents are able to decide the stories that they're covering. Well, not in our case.
Stories are decided before they head out the door?
Well, we know the assignment is discussed before it is. I mean, once people go to land where they're going, they have the autonomy of reporting the story. But if it's, I think this is a different kind of question for print.
In our case, I'll give an example of Beijing. Our Asia correspondent, Janice Mackey-Freyer, she will decide on the story, then she will contact our foreign editor in Toronto, and they will discuss whether she covers it or not. But they usually have the autonomy. They're on the ground there. They find their stories, and they say, hey, I'm going to do this today. And we usually let them, unless it's something that we just know no one would be interested in. But that's pretty rare. But they're pretty autonomous.
Yeah, I mean, outside of the obvious, we actually, I mean, autonomy is one way of looking at it. We rely on them to tell us what stories they're going to cover. I mean, we put someone in Los Angeles last year, and it wasn't like we were going to be, you know, scanning the newspapers and figuring out what they were going to cover. It's really up to Kim in this case there to just provide a steady stream of stories. And so, yes, there has to be some buy-in, although not in the way it used to be. If there's things that work just on digital, that's can often be fine, or radio. But yeah, we rely on them to actually to tell us what they're doing and to come up with stories.
Yeah, they're on the ground. We're sitting in Toronto.
Right.
They know what's there. We don't.
Okay, let's go over here.
Hi, my name is Beatrice Orchard. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Waterloo, and my question is directed at the panel. Generally, it is about censorship, because I've noticed that the panel has identified how social media has been able to circumvent censorship to a certain degree. But I would like to hear about how does it affect what stories you were able to research, how you can file them. Does it impact your ability to return to various areas and continue to do journalism, or has it led to you to being blocked out entirely at times?
David.
We do. We don't lose stories necessarily, but we're unable to report them in real time because of the authoritarian regimes that we're dealing with. We often will employ peculiar techniques that allow us to get the story and produce it at a later date. We will seldom, but on occasion, use subterfuge, which is a real exception. And you have to always assess it based on, is it worth it? Is it worth it? Because if you go in surreptitiously to a country that's got a closed border and you get caught, you have to finish the sentence.
I think the number of countries that have added journalist visas that they didn't used to have them has increased quite a bit over, and to David's point, you really shouldn't go in without one. Sometimes it depends on the high public interest in we do, but it's just increasingly difficult to get those journalist visas out of certain countries. I mean, we waited, I don't know how long, and we sent the reporter to go and sit in the Nigerian embassy to get one to get into Nigeria last year.
So I can't get into Iran at the minute, you know, and I got into Iran about 4 years ago, and it seems wrong on all sides that we can't tell that side of the story. It's one of the great stories of the decade, and there's just no capacity to get in there at all. So the censorship begins. It's not that you're reducing your aperture once you're in there and you decide to sort of calcify your thinking. It's not even available to you if you're to do it by the rules.
Okay, let's go over here.
Hey, hello. My name is Sarah McKeever, and I'm a journalism student, and I'm just trying to figure out how I'm supposed to jump into this ocean current of an industry. And I want to know how you, as established journalists, define the Canadian perspective as a foreign correspondent. How, if I'm going to be a foreign correspondent anywhere in the world, how do I define that Canadian perspective to bring it back to my Canadian audience?
Good question, Jonathan. Why don't you start?
I mean, beyond what we've said before, I guess I would just add that there are some themes that are universal. So I know in the case of our Pocket Bureau in Turkey, you know, one of the stories that Neil did there was daycare. It did really well. It wasn't on the national, but it did, or on radio, but did really well digitally, because it's a universal theme. So I think it's thinking beyond just what's relevant in an obvious way to Canadians and understanding what themes are universal, what things are interesting to Canadians. David's talked about California, so you can look at places that have a Canadian connection. You know, what are the countries with the most numbers of expats? So India and China are obvious choices there. But I think it's thinking beyond what, you know, specifically what is the Canadian connection and to what will have resonance with people here, either as a universal theme or even as a country that just has a lot of people in Canada who come from that country, or a family that come from that country.
And really study the country before you go in. Read a lot. It's amazing what
I would say also look at Canadian foreign policy announcements or immigration announcements and then do a reality check on them. We did this because the government cut off visas to people coming in from Hungary, believing that there were a lot of Romas coming in and that they weren't discriminated against in Hungary. So we sent a reporter there to find out, okay, what is the level of discrimination there? He spent about 2.5 weeks there, and there is, I would argue, his story showed that there was substantial discrimination against Roma there. I mean, there's lots of those points where we make announcements, and you can.
And take the arc of what was the initial authorship or initiative of the policy, and then when it lands, often with the best of intent. I mean, bureaucrats and politicians, they get a bad name, and it's partly because we are far too binary, they're good or they're bad. But most people get into life with good intentions and into those roles. That the policies of the politics end up landing where they're supposed to land, but are they not effective, and why is that? And having a sympathetic ear is also helpful.
And remember that for all of us here, we subscribe to different but multiple news services, Reuters, AP. So if you're thinking in terms of stories, understand that we have access to basically anything that's happening in an official capacity, Senate hearings, things that are happening in Congress, et cetera, et cetera. So it really is thinking beyond that and trying to figure out what is a story that will resonate that we just don't know about as managers or as desk people. Because we have access, particularly digitally. I mean, there's still some value in having a broadcast journalist and personality do a story, but on the digital side, there's not a lot of value in delivering stories that we can get, not for free, but through our syndication services.
Okay, let's go over here.
I see the monitor over there. Mine sort of dovetails with the U.S. question.
Excellent. Okay, so David from Kitchener and you
Sure.
are asking this question.
Father Lawrence Parent, future pastor up at Blessed Sacrament Church in Kitchener. I just 2 weeks back from living 4.5 years in the U.S. in Connecticut, and after 4 years of MSNBC, CNN, and Fox News, I canceled cable, and it was one of the best decisions I ever made. So then I started looking on my tablet on the computer, and I went to CBC. CBC, and a little app for Globe and Mail. And yet, as I'm reading the news, I realized a lot of the foreign news was focused on the U.S. And then I believe Wendy said CTV has 5 foreign affiliates or something like that, 2 of them in the U.S. And I bet, I don't know, but they're probably the largest affiliates. I wouldn't be surprised, or bureaus, whatever you want to call them.
No, they aren't.
They're
London,
not?
Washington is, but not LA.
Okay. Still a chunk. Just world news seem to have a large bias towards U.S. coverage. Just wondering, is that what the Canadian eyes see? I know that Americans think the world of themselves. Is that what Canadian eyes want to see as well? And is there any problematic in that bias? Just as an example, I've heard lots about ISIS destroying World Heritage sites, which is tragic, but I barely see anything about bombing sorties, probably mostly led by the U.S. Is there bias there in world news that gravitates towards the U.S., and can that bias be detrimental in ways?
Jonathan.
There's a lot of interest in U.S. news. I would repeat that for us, it isn't about routine news, and increasingly that's the case. But there certainly is a lot of interest. It strikes me as interesting. Sometimes I was in the U.S. for at least one primary cycle, and it's amazing to go on a primary trail and find an incredible number of news organizations from around the world. So you can have 100, 150 journalists following candidates in New Hampshire, and it's interesting to remember this isn't even about the election. This is about picking the candidate for the election. So whatever it is, it's a reality. There's an interest in this world in American politics to the point of minutia. I mean, we barely cover our own leadership campaigns. So to see that interest is astonishing. But the majority of our people are not in the U.S. We are positioned around the world. So I have to do content analysis, but it isn't mostly U.S. foreign news that we do. But there's no doubt and no question that there's an interest in what happens in the U.S. There just is from a Canadian perspective.
And they are our neighbors too, and we cover our neighbors. But it's the same with us. Our London bureau is big. Washington is our biggest foreign bureau, and after that, London. But we have a very large neighbor south of the border, and we cover it a lot.
The United States is a great story. You can't get away from it. And it's on every level. We're based in Oregon, rather eccentrically. Washington.
Because of your limitless resources.
Limitless resources, yeah. It's fresh water. Washington, New York, and opening in California. But I think as well, and this comes back to the question of the parachuting of correspondence, as the electoral cycle gets more intense, so that's possible, we'll send people who are great writers like Ian Brown through the homeland, just explore it and tell the stories, or Konrad Jakubowski, and just tell the stories of the Americans that he comes across. And I think that provides a national perspective. That's absolutely where you want the Canadian eye in a country that is our neighbor, that we are familiar with, we do visit, we do see it, and come back with a perspective that's slightly different.
Okay, let's have one last question over here.
My name is Paul. I have a question about follow-ups. What percentage of your foreign correspondence budgets tend to go to following stories up? I don't know if you need any context, but I mean, just to think of one example, whether I wanted to or not, every day I would see news stories about Ebola, and now I don't see those kinds of stories, and I don't know what's happening. And I don't know, is it my fault for not following up, or is it the fault of the news organizations? How does this happen?
It's your fault. Sorry.
I agree. Maybe you want to expand on that.
No, it's not your fault. Ebola it's a good example, and the point's well taken. It was an incredibly difficult deployment to Liberia. Not only the usual safety hazards, but just bringing people back, bringing our staff back to Canada and then quarantining them for 21 days created all kinds of issues we never ever dealt with before. So I think part of that issue is just around the very difficult nature of covering that story. But I think it's a point well taken, and I think we all agree, certainly in our news, we don't do enough follow-up. And when we do, it tends to be around anniversaries. So we've been back to Haiti, we've been back to South Asia for tsunami coverage. We've been back, we went back to Pakistan or Bangladesh around some of the tragedies there in the garment factory. So we do tend to do it around anniversaries, but it's not your fault. It is a point well taken, and we should do more. We should do more around it.
We need to do more follow-up, absolutely. And that's something that we, make note of and we talk about every day, but you're absolutely right.
We did a spread fairly recently in the paper involving some images of refugees, and there were a number that we knew we could trace back. So the images that we had were from wires, and I sent our guy from Beijing to Indonesia that day, and he tracked them down and he told the story. The problem is sometimes you can miss them. We need to do a better job of packaging that material so it's almost bottled and you can find it. On Ebola specifically, we've been working for about 4 months, and we have another 3 months to go. We've got a 7-month highly intense project that's due for the fall on Ebola that will return us to that story in terms of how it is the story could not be truly forgotten, and some of the lessons learned from it, which I think will be pretty instructional. So get a subscription if you haven't got one.
Okay, we have 1 minute left for this panel, so one sentence from each of you. What is foreign correspondence going to look like down the road?
I think I've done best to answer that, so if I have 15 seconds, I just want to thank everybody for coming. I think what's inspirational for me is that there's this much interest in it, and interest in how we do our jobs, and it's good to know people are watching, even young people apparently, and are interested in how we work, and it just makes it all worthwhile. So,
Wendy?
And again, thank you for coming. Again, a multimedia tasker that can do everything, but most importantly, have a curiosity of the world and be a great writer.
I think there will be more foreign correspondence in the years to come. I think the challenge is not diluting the Canadian voice as that becomes an increasing force.
Yeah, I don't really know what much more to add, except to say that there will be more. I think it will move faster, and I think the decisions that we make about which stories we cover will come to define each of these organizations. And I think that's going to be very important for us to deal with. Sorry, I've somehow lost my voice.
Thanks to all of you. It is good to hear that there still is passion and dedication to bringing the world home. And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Fred.
A few quick comments before we adjourn. First of all, thank you, Susan, for your moderation of tonight's panel, and to our panelists, David, Wendy, Jonathan, and Lynn, for your expert contributions to the discussion. You know, these are incredibly demanding jobs that these people do, running Canada's largest newsrooms. And the pressures are around the clock. They're 24/7. The cell phone rings at midnight and at 4 a.m. It's not only high-maintenance reporters or editors and producers in crisis, but sometimes it's a world of trouble raining down from the corporate head office. And so when CIGI reached out to top executives of CTV, Globe, Star, and CBC to ask them to participate in this panel, it was a minor miracle that we got so many quick yeses. I put it down to either a desire to get out of the office for a day, or more likely, how important all of them consider the core question of tonight's panel discussion to be. And I think media feel accountable to their audiences, to their funders, to the people who pay the bills, to explain what they do on these important issues. And so it was very reassuring to hear that foreign news is important to all of these organizations, and they're finding new ways to produce and deliver even more foreign news as technology changes the picture. As a global policy think tank, CIGI, of course, thinks it's incredibly important domestically for Canadians and Canada to be constructive players on the world stage, whether it's the prosperity agenda or climate and sustainability or issues such as cybersecurity or terrorism. The world is a shrinking place. There are fewer firewalls than there used to be, and distance doesn't protect us. And so it's important for Canadians to understand the world in which they live. And for that, we turn to the media organizations that we trust the most. And so for the work that you do, which is very important, and also for being so generous with your time today and giving us this incredible behind-the-scenes picture of how you make your decisions, we thank you once again. The edited video of tonight's webcast will be posted to the CIGI website, and we welcome your thoughts about it. This evening's event concludes the CIGI Signature Lecture Series for the season. We thank the CIC once again for being the co-sponsor. We thank our volunteers, as you heard at the video, for the whole season of support. And after the summer hiatus, the lectures in the CIGI Cinema Series will both resume in September. We already have some excellent speakers lined up. You can learn more about that by subscribing to our events newsletter at our CIGI website. In the meantime, thanks for coming. Have a great summer and have a safe journey home.